So my first question for you is this great inflation of the U.S. caused by the policy mistakes by the Federal Reserve? Is it related to the last round of quantitative easing, please?
Yes, thank you very much. And let me just say it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. And it's a great honor to have you actually as the moderator. I am particularly grateful for that. Well, to answer your question, in short, yes, it is a result, this inflation is a result of the Federal Reserve's policy actions, particularly in the year 2020 from March onwards. And in fact, at the time in that year, I did monitor the central bank's policies, and I was shocked by what they were doing, because to me it was clear they were creating inflation. And so I actually went public in May 2020, and I warned, and I said that in writing, I said that around 18 months later, we're likely to get significant inflation. This is what we're experiencing now. So it is entirely the result of Federal Reserve and in other countries, also European countries, central bank actions as they expanded credit creation of the banking system for consumption. Of course, it was also furthered by government actions to give guarantees to banks to just lend willy-nilly these were various schemes to expand lending. And at the same time, checks were handed out for furloughed workers. But it was really the central bank's actions to expand bank credit creation that were the most important factor.
Okay, so Richard, so do you think the cost inflation is they are intended to cause inflation, or they are unintended to cause inflation?
Well, with central banks, one always has the option that, it's a mistake as a possible explanation. However, I've monitored them for many decades, particularly, European and North American central banks. And often you really wonder, is this really just a mistake? Because it seems very consistent mistakes that seem to align with other goals and agendas. So to me, it's also interesting if we compare this to the 1970s, where we had also significant inflation. And it's interesting because the story in the media is quite similar. In the media, it's being said, there's a war, this time it's Russia, and there's an embargo, and oil, gas exports are being reduced, we have an oil shock, so there's inflation. That story is almost exactly the story of the 70s. There was a war in the Middle East, oil embargo, OPEC, oil price shock, therefore inflation. So to a lot of people, it seems, this makes sense, can't be helped, it's a shock. But when you examine the 70s, you realize that the inflation started before that war and before that OPEC embargo and before oil prices even rose. They only rose essentially from December 73, January 74. But inflation started earlier. We had significant inflation in Germany, in the US, in the UK already in early 73. Why is that? And if you then analyze bank credit creation, 1 year before, so we're talking of 72, early 73, that's where we had massive expansions in bank credit, and that clearly is also the reason in the 70s. So same in the 20s. And so how can this be a mistake? Because these are deliberate policies that you didn't have to take. Also, if we compare this QE of 2020 with the QE of 2008, there is a very important fundamental difference. And the 2008 QE was of a type that was non-inflationary. That can be done. We can talk about it if you want. And then 2020 QE was of that type that will create inflation. And the evidence is, I'm not saying this afterwards. I was actually at the time already in 2008, 2009 saying, no, this is not going to cause inflation. Now I'm in 2020, I warned this is inflationary type of QE. So it makes it hard to believe that it's just a mistake.
Okay. So I know that the term quantitative easing is somehow is related to your earlier work. So would you please explain in brief, so what's the central idea of qualitative easing? Does it really work?
Thank you very much. Yes. Well, I coined this in Japan when I was there in the early 1990s. And you have to understand the situation. The situation was that, first of all, in the 1980s, Japanese banks were creating a lot of bank credit for property real estate transactions. And when banks lend money, it's not just existing money. Actually, banks don't really lend money, they create money. So a loan is credit creation, money creation. It adds to the money supply. So a lot of money was added to the money supply to purchase property. So property prices went up, land prices were crazy in the 80s. And this game continues until they stop doing this and stop lending for property transactions. Then the land prices come down, and usually, and so essentially it's an asset bubble which will then collapse. And it will take the banking system with them if it's big enough. And it was very, very big in Japan. So I warned about this in 91 in my publications, that there will be a big crash, the banks will go bust, and there will be a big recession like the Great Depression. And this was, the beginnings was starting to happen 92, 93, but it was early stage. Most people thought there's no problem, it's just a slowdown. They do the usual interest rate reduction and everything will be fine. But I was convinced, this is going to be really bad. And I was, at the time, chief economist of a British investment bank in Tokyo. So then I wrote an article published in the Nikkei, that's the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, the Japanese main financial daily newspaper. Stock index is also named after that. And I had a big article in there saying, well, there is a policy with which we can prevent this big problem and very quickly have a recovery. And what we need to do is clean up the bank balance sheets from the bad debts of the 80s. The central bank can do this by purchasing non-performing assets from the banks, putting them on the central bank balance sheet, because you can do this through a subsidiary or directly. I mean, these are details. And essentially, if you buy them at close to nominal value, the banking system very obviously will be completely strong again and very liquid and happy to lend. This QE proposal, that's one type of QE proposal I made. That's what Ben Bernanke did in 2008 at the Federal Reserve. He understood this. He was part of the debates on Japan in the 90s. And that's why he even gave a speech at the LSE, which is my alma mater, where I did my first degree in 2009, January, where he said, well, I don't want to call this what the Bank of Japan is called QE, because it's really more about credit. And the reason why he said is that, unfortunately, in Japan, they didn't take my advice. They then later used the name QE, and they said, oh, okay, well, let's do this. We're doing it. But really, they were just doing traditional monetarist, high-powered money expansion by essentially intervening and giving banks a lot of bank reserves. That doesn't help anything. So, but Ben Bernanke did the right policies in 2008. So as a result, the US banking system recovered quickest of any, despite the fact that that was the center of the crisis. However, what happened in 2020 was another type of QE, a different type. So Ben Bernanke was essentially doing what I advised, that the goal was to get out of a banking crisis, an incipient banking crisis, and have a recovery by helping the banks clean balance sheet and expand credit. But I also pointed out there's a faster way to do this, the second method, and that is for the central bank to purchase assets from the non-bank sector. Because when the central bank purchases assets from the non-bank sector, which is a bit unusual, but QE was a sort of unusual, unorthodox monetary policy proposal. When the central bank does that, the asset sellers, let's say, it can be anything, can be pension funds owning bonds, as a simple example, but can be anything really. The seller has an account at a bank, and that account at the bank is now credited with the money from the central bank buying the assets, and therefore the bank now creates a new deposit on the liability side of the bank, which adds to the money supply, and there's new purchasing power now in the economy. That policy, the Bank of Japan, for 20 years, been saying, oh, we can't do that, that's impossible, what is he talking about? Well, funny enough, in March 2020, the Bank of Japan suddenly did it. It suddenly knew exactly how to do it. And the ECB did it, and the Bank of England did it, and the Federal Reserve did it. But it did it at the time when there was no decline in bank credit. My advice to Japan in the 1990s was when bank credit was collapsing, was going to zero, and also contraction, negative credit growth. And then you need to stimulate it. My proposal, the 2 times of QE, there's also some other policies, but these are the key ones. The proposals to expand bank credit again, then you get a recovery. But they adopted this in March 2020 at a time when bank credit was very strong in most countries already, and made it even stronger. It was an excessive monetary expansion, and at the same time they imposed restrictions on businesses to close down movement of people and so on. So the supply side was restricted. Now what happens? If you restrict the supply side and you increase the demand side extraordinarily, the biggest perhaps in the post-war era, you must get inflation, and that's what we got.
Okay, I see. So, Richard, so how do you evaluate the contribution of quantitative easing to the economy overall? I know that's a different country adopt different type of policy at a different type of time. Then overall,
yes.
How do you evaluate its contribution?
Yes. Well, I would say there's 2 aspects of the contribution. One is that it's really in the name already, quantitative easing. One contribution is to make people aware that when we talk about monetary policy, it is not always just about the price. Because in English language, modern economics for the last 200 years, since David Ricardo's classical economics onwards, Alfred Marshall Keynes, monetarism, Friedman, new classical, contemporary monetary economics, the whole history, they've always emphasized prices, including the price of money. And that's a phenomenon when you use an equilibrium framework, then prices are key in equilibrium. But what quantitative easing has shown is that we should not neglect the quantity side of things, not just the price of things, but also the quantity. And that's particularly important when markets are not in equilibrium. Then you'd expect quantities to be more important. And as the name suggests, quantitative easing is essentially a statement saying, well, quantities can be extremely powerful, and perhaps they're even more important than the price, like interest rates. So that's one contribution. It's a sort of fundamental contribution. The other contribution, more on the policy side, is I think it's been demonstrated to have a significant impact. But of course, like any powerful tool, you have to be careful in how you use it. You know, any tool where you work in a workshop or in the garden even can also be dangerous if you use it wrongly, and then maybe you hurt somebody. So any tool is also responsibility, and we have to use it wisely. And I'm afraid central banks have not always used it wisely. So I would say there is a significant contribution, both in terms of theory and also in terms of practical application. And on the practical application, I would just caution that we have to use it wisely and appropriately. And it was a tool developed for weak economic growth and a collapsing banking system to help in that emergency situation. And therefore, we should use it in those times, not when we actually restrict supply and we already have strong demand and it's going to cause inflation.
Okay, Richard, you mentioned wisely several times. So, in your opinion, so what prevent a central bank from using these tools wisely? So I think they also want to be using it wisely, but what prevent them from being wisely?
Yes, well, thank you. That's a very good question. Good point. There's 2 angles. One is just assuming that they have the same goals that we would also have. And I think as you're a leading economist and financial sector expert, and I think we would all agree that it is good to have financial stability and to have stable, sustainable economic growth. And so most people work with this as a premise, and they assume that, of course, that's the goal. So what do we do to achieve this goal? And if we assume that has been the goal, then they haven't used it wisely in 2020. But why not? And it seems they were either misinformed, or there seemed to have been some kind of coordination at play. As I said, what they did in 2020, this purchase of assets from non-banks, is very specific. It's very unusual and also very rare to implement that policy if you go into central bank history. So, but they all did the same thing at the same time, so that it's quite obvious it was coordinated. So that's an interesting empirical question to research into. Who was leading that coordination? What was their thinking? And what were the goals? And I don't have the details yet, but we should look into this. Perhaps as a research project, we're very interested. But the other answer to your question is that it may also be that their goals were different from what we would sensibly, like to have as a goal, namely financial stability, economic growth, sustainable growth. And I've encountered this before, and initially it's a bit surprising, but it can be that sometimes policymakers take the view that sometimes a shock to the system is good, and sometimes we need a crisis in order to make changes. Now, I'm a critic of that. If that is the case, then that's not good, but that could also be a reason why they were not wise.